According to my mom, I was the only person in the family to talk back to Dandy when he yelled. I did it regularly because it drove me crazy that my grandmother wouldn't speak up for herself and because everyone else fell silent around him. And lastly, I didn't I did it because I loved Dandy as much as he was hard for me to understand. His stubbornness was something I recognized in myself. There was also a softness and dandy which I caught only in glimmers. He tenderly rubbed my neck sometimes when I sat at the foot of his reclining chair. He smiled when my dad said something funny or one of us kids managed to slip a sophisticated word into a conversation, but then something would set him up, and he'd start snarling again. Quit shouting quit shouting at everyone, Dandy, I'd say, or don't be mean to Grandma. Often I'd add. What's got you so mad anyway? I answered. The answer to that question was both complicated and simple. Dandy himself would leave it unanswered, shrugging crankily, and returning to his newspaper back at home, though my parents would try to explain. Dandy was Dandy was from the South Carolina Low Country, having grown up in the humid seaport of Georgetown, where thousands of slaves once labored on vast plantations, harvesting crops of rice and indigo and marking their owners rich. My grandfather, born in 1920, was the grandson of slaves, the son of a mill worker, and the oldest of 10 children, a quick-witted and intelligent kid. He'd been nicknamed the Professor and set his sights early on, on the idea of some some someday going to college. But not only was he black and from a poor family, he also came of age during the Great Depression. After finishing high school, Dandy went to work at a lumber mill, knowing that if he stayed in Georgetown, his options would never widen. When the mill eventually closed, like many African Americans of his generation, he took a chance and moved north to Chicago, joining what became known as the Great Migration, in which 6 million Southern blacks relocated to big northern cities over the course of 5 decades, fleeing rash- racial oppressions, oppressions and chasing industrial jobs. If this were an American dream story, Dandy, who arrived in Chicago in the early 1930s, would have found a good job and a pathway to college, but the reality was far different. Jobs were hard to come by, limited, at least somewhat, by the fact that managers at some of the big factories in Chicago regularly hired European immigrants over African American workers. Dandy took what work he could find setting pins in a bowling alley and working as a handyman. Gradually he let go of his hopes of going to college. I think thinking he'd train to become an electrician instead, but this too was not possible. If you wanted to work as an electrician or as a steel worker, carpenter, or plumber on any of the big job sites in Chicago, you needed an onion card. And if you were black, the overwhelming odds were that you weren't going to get one. This particular form of discrimination altered the destinies of generations of African Americans, including many of the men in my family. It limited their income, their opportunity, and eventually, eventually their dreams. As a carpenter, Southside wasn't allowed to work for the larger construction companies that offered steady pay because he couldn't join a labor union. My great uncle Terry, Robbie's husband, had abandoned a career as a plumber for the same reason, instead becoming a Pullman porter. There was also Uncle Pete on my mom's side, who'd been unable to join the taxi drivers union and instead turned to driving an unlicensed cab, picking up customers who lived in a less safe parts of the West Side, where normal cabs didn't like to go. These were highly intelligent, able-bodied men who were denied stable, high-paying jobs, which in turn kept them from being able to buy homes, send their kids to college, or save for retirement. It pained them, I know, to be cast aside, to be stuck in jobs that they were overqualified for. They watched white people leapfrog past them at work, sometimes training new employees they knew might one day become their bosses, and it made them feel at least a basic level of resentment and mistrust. You never quite knew what other folks saw you to be.